Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. Welcome back to another episode of Ranking Stephen King Decades. Now, for this one, it's going to be episode 8. And again, this will be another two-part series because in the 2010s, which is the decade that I'm ranking for the next two episodes, the 2010s have 15 Stephen King books. So I went ahead and split this into two parts. And for this episode, for part 1, I will be ranking 7 books. And these 7 books are my least favorite from the 2010s. And really, most of these books are just fine. Like, they're slightly mediocre, they're decent, they're fine. The bottom 2 I really don't like. They're some of my least favorite Stephen King stories ever. But then the rest of them, they're more like 3-star books. And then for part 2, which will be next week, some of my all-time favorite Stephen King books are from the 2010s. So the dichotomy between part 1 and part 2 will be immense. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So for number 15 on the list here, we have easily one of my least favorite Stephen King stories ever. Definitely my least favorite from the 2010s. And I was severely disappointed when this came out and I finally got to read it. And I'm, of course, talking about Elevation, which is very short. It says that it's a novel on the cover, but that's bullshit. It's more of a novella, and you could kind of argue it's a glorified short story. It's really not good, very boring, very bland characters, a recycled premise from Thinner, because you've basically got this guy, I can't even remember his name, but essentially he's losing weight, but he doesn't look like he's losing weight. So eventually, he's going to float away, and it's so stupid. And then the background characters, like King really tries his best to be very, political and like liberal with this book, which, I am liberal minded, but when it's just like hand fisted into the book, like just, and not only that, but like that part of the book didn't really bother me too much. The main problem with this book is that there's no stakes. There's really no conflict with this book, and the characters are super bland. Like it's really a boring mess. It really bothered me that I paid like almost full price for this book because it's very short. It only took me like an hour or so to read, and it's just so boring, and it's just felt like a waste of time, a waste of money. Easily one of my least favorite Stephen King experiences I've ever had. I really don't ever feel the need to reread it again, so for all of those reasons, I'm going to have to go with Elevation for number 15 on the list. And coming in at number 14 on the list, this book is not much better, and that would be End of Watch. And this is the third book in the Bill Hodges trilogy, with the first book being Finders Keepers, and the first book being Mr. Mercedes, and the second book being Finders Keepers. Mr. Mercedes is pretty good. Finders Keepers is really good. And for this book, it was super disappointing. One of the worst ending books in a trilogy I've ever read. And the main reason is because King does this thing a lot where he introduces a supernatural element that just didn't work, and it didn't need to be there for the story to be compelling. He did that with so many books where you get like halfway through a book and then he kind of introduces this weird supernatural element, and you're just like, why? Like, the story was already good without it, and then you introduce this weird thing that's not even good to begin with. Like, if you're going to introduce a supernatural element to a story, at least make it good. For this one, it was especially stupid because in the first two books, he establishes that this is like a real world with no really supernatural elements. Like the first two books don't have any supernatural elements. And then all of a sudden in the third book, it's like a major part of the plot. And you're just like, why? It's so dumb. Like I was so disappointed with this book. I really don't ever feel the need to reread it again. So yeah, it's a 2-star book for me. Like it has some good moments and some good character moments, but overall this was just a severe disappointment and I really don't like it. So End of Watch comes in at number 14 on the list. And for number 13 on the list, we have Sleeping Beauties. Now, when I first read this book when it came out, I think it came out in like 2017, I thought it was slightly underrated. A lot of people were giving this book 1 or 2 stars and they just hated this book. I loved the first half of this book when I first read it. And then the second half, I did enjoy it. But the reason why it's so low on the list now is that it's very forgettable. Like, I remember very little about this book besides maybe the premise and the ending. Really, I don't remember any of the characters. There's no real standout characters. And like I said, the majority of this book I've just forgotten since I read this book 5 years ago. And I really also don't feel the need to go back and reread it anytime soon. But yeah, it's gotten lower on my list. Like when I did my overall ranking for Stephen King last year, people were surprised that I had this higher than some other books. It would probably be a lot lower this time around. It's just not very memorable. So I really don't have too much to say about it because I don't remember a whole lot about it. I remember the premise being really cool, and it's about all I can say, really. And overall, just like the ending of this book and like the themes and messages were kind of jumbled and messy, because essentially what you get is 2 white guys trying to write a feminist book, and it really didn't stick the landing, really. It was fine, but yeah, there's definitely a lot more Stephen King books that are better, and yeah, for those reasons and lack of reasons, number 13 is Sleeping Beauties. Now for number 12, I know this is going to make people upset because it's it's a lot of people's favorite Stephen King book. And I get it. I totally get it. But for me, I just think it's one of Stephen King's most overrated books. You probably know what I'm talking about if you've seen my channel before. But let's just go ahead and jump into it. It's 11/22/63. Now, when I first started reading this book, it was so good. Like, the premise of this book is amazing. This guy named Jake finds a way to time travel back in time, and his goal is to try to prevent the JFK assassination. And what a cool premise that is, and Stephen King obviously did a ton of research to write this book. And I know that he had this idea for a while, and he just really couldn't get it going because there was just so much research he had to do. But he finally did it, and I will admit, like the first, 300, 400 pages of this behemoth of a book is really good. My main problem is like the middle chunk of this book, where it deals more about like the romance and some other side stuff that has nothing to do with the JFK assassination. I really didn't enjoy that aspect of the book. I know people love this book and that's one of their favorite parts of the book. But for me, I was just so bored. I wanted this book to be cut in half and for it to only deal with the plot of the JFK assassination. Like, if it would have just been that, this probably would have been one of my favorite Stephen King books. But dealing with all of that stuff and some other stuff that I can't get into because of spoilers, I thought this book was fine. I settled around 3 stars just because, the first part of this book was great, and then the middle part was meh, and then the ending was good. I know people love this book, but for me, it's severely overrated. And for all of that reasons, I'm going to have to put 11/22/63 at number 12 on the list. for number 11 on the list, this is another book that I would say is slightly overrated, not so much overrated as 11/22/63 is, but I know a lot of people love this book, and for me, it's kind of meh. It's more of a 3-star book. All right, enough beating around the bush. Number 11 is The Institute, another book that I was very excited to read a few years ago. I think it came out in 2019, possibly. I don't remember. But, you know, I had so much expectations going into this book because I knew going in it was dealing with children with supernatural abilities and like them like a government agency or a secret agency like kidnapping kids to kind of experiment on them. And that sounded so much like Firestarter. And there was rumors going around that like an older Charlie McGee was going to be in this book. So I was super excited to see if that was going to happen. Spoiler alerts, it doesn't. Like, it doesn't pan out that way. So that part is kind of underwhelming for me. Another reason why this book is a lot lower on the list is because the first chapter of this book is amazing. It introduces a character that's really compelling for like the first 40 pages, and then you don't see him again for another 300 pages. And then the rest of the book is kind of dealing with these kid characters. And while that stuff was good, I just fell in love with that character in the first 40 pages, and I wish we would have gotten more of him sprinkled out through the story, but it was just like, oh, here he is, and then you don't see him again for 300 pages. I'm like, damn it. So that part of the book also was kind of wonky for me, but, you know, the book is good. And then also another main complaint is the ending. The ending is just super weird, and it took me a while to kind of comprehend what exactly was going on. But, you know, it's a fine Stephen King book. Like, it's a 3-star book. Nothing special. Nothing that I'm super interested to go back and reread anytime soon. But it is decent. It's not terrible. And for all of those reasons, it's number 11 on the list. And for number 10 on the list, we have The Bazaar of Bad Dreams, which is currently the last Stephen King short story collection that he's written. And for this one, when I first read it back in 2015, I was pretty disappointed with it. But it is one of the collections that I'm the most intrigued to go back and read, because I know before this, I had really only read like Night Shift and Skeleton Crew, and I loved those short story collections. With this one, though, he strays away from horror a bit, and a lot of these are more on the literary side, which probably when I read that in 2015, a lot of the stories maybe went over my head, or I just didn't care for that writing style or that genre. But I think reading it now that I'm more of an experienced reader, I think I will appreciate a lot more of these stories now. So even though I didn't like it at the time, like I really didn't like it, it's one of those Stephen King books that I'm really interested to reread because I think my opinion will change because of it. So for that reason, it is higher on the list than probably some books that are objectively better than this one. But, you know, when I do my rankings, I always base them off of my enjoyment and off of rereadability. So even though some of these books are good, a lot of them, you know, on the lower side of the things, I just really don't have a lot of desire to go back and reread. But for this one, even though it was lower, I do want to go back and reread it to see if my opinion changes. So yeah, I'm super excited to read this eventually when we get to it in the Stephen King Short Story Book Club, which if you don't know, shameless plug, Stephen King Short Story Book Club is still going on in the Bookish Drummer Discord. We're currently about a little bit more than halfway through Nightmares and Dreamscapes. We'll finish that up in December, and then next year we'll read the 3 other short story collections he has. Everything's Eventual, Just After Sunset, and Bazaar of Bad Dreams. So shameless plug ended, and tangent ended. I really don't have too much more to say about this one, so Bazaar of Bad Dreams is number 10 on the list. And for number 9 for my ranking in the last video, or the last book I have to talk about in this video, would have to be The Win Through the Keyhole, which is Dark Tower book 4.5. So chronologically, this takes place between book 4, Wizard and Glass, and book 5, Wolves of the Kala. Although the publication date, this was the last Dark Tower book published back in 2012, and this was after the final book was written and published in 2004. So an 8-year gap, and then Stephen King decides to publish this kind of weird Dark Tower-ish story. Like, really, you can read the Dark Tower series, like books 1 through 7, and not read this, and it won't affect it. This one is probably my least favorite Dark Tower book now. I always thought it was Wolves of the Kala, but at least Wolves of the Kala like deals with the plot of the series, even though I don't like some aspects of that book. This one was kind of a chore to get through. It's still a 3-star book, but it's kind of Roland telling a story within a story within a story. So you've got kind of that nested narrative, and really the only main one that I enjoy is kind of the middle chunk of this one, where it is dealing with, you know, a boy and this tiger. I won't spoil about, you know, what that is, but that part of the story was actually pretty good. I wish we would have gotten actually more with that. But this one is just fine. And like I said, it doesn't really have much to do with the actual Dark Tower plot. It's fine. And it also doesn't help that I listened to the audio, which is narrated by Stephen King, and Stephen King just really isn't that good of a narrator, especially with, you know, Dark Tower is brilliantly narrated by both Frank Muller and George Goodall. They both do a fantastic job. And then King, it was just atrocious, because he does no voices. So him narrating the story just did not do it any justice. So that doesn't help either. So yeah, it's probably my least favorite Dark Tower book now that I'm thinking about it. So I Went Through the Keyhole comes in at number 9 on the list. All right, so that wraps up part 1 of my 2010 Stephen King rankings. Stay tuned for next week when I talk about part 2, which is my favorite books from the 2010s written by Stephen King. What do you guys think of my rankings thus far? I know a lot of people are going to severely disagree with me on 11/22/63, but do you also agree with me about like End of Watch or Elevation? Or did I talk about some of your all-time favorite Stephen King books in here? Please let me know all of your great comments down below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. And if you're not already a part of the Book Astronomer Discord, you can go sign up for that. And if you want to go participate in the Stephen King Readathon, which will be taking place in October, you can sign up for that as well. Submissions for that will end September 30th. So make sure to do that before that. And also I have my Patreon if anyone wants to go support me there. I have my Amazon wish list if anyone would like to buy me a book. And thank you guys so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.